The leather reins had worn grooves into Quinton Irons's calloused palms over 43 years of hard living, but nothing had worn deeper than the silence he carried in his chest since Martha died. He sat at the long table in his ranch house outside Nevada, Missouri, staring at the plate of beans and bacon his ranch hand had prepared, pushing the food around with his fork while the autumn wind of 1882 rattled the windows. "Boss, you need to eat something proper," said Tommy, the youngest of his crew, watching from the doorway with concerned eyes. Quinton said nothing, just stood and walked out to the porch, leaving the plate untouched. The Irons Ranch sprawled across 2,000 acres of Missouri grassland, cattle dotting the rolling hills like scattered seeds. He had built it all with Martha by his side, her laughter filling the spaces between the hard work and harder winters. 20 years since she passed from fever, and 20 years since food had tasted like anything more than ash in his mouth. He ate to survive, nothing more. The men who worked for him knew better than to expect compliments on their cooking or anything else they did. Quinton paid fair wages and kept his word spare as winter rain. The town of Nevada sat 3 miles east, a bustling railroad stop where cattle were loaded and shipped to Kansas City and beyond. Quinton made the trip once a week for supplies, always the same route, always the same stores, always the same tight-lipped transactions. He had no use for the socializing that happened in the saloons or at church gatherings. His life was his cattle, his land, and the memory of a woman who had been dead longer than some of his ranch hands had been alive. October brought a chill to the prairie, and with it came news that rippled through the town like wind through wheat. A widow from St. Louis had purchased the old Garrett place on the southern edge of town, planning to open a boarding house. Quinton heard the gossip at the general store while buying grain and paid it no mind. Widows and boarding houses were none of his concern. But Tommy came back from town 2 weeks later with his eyes bright and his stomach apparently full. "Boss, you should taste what Mrs. Barrett makes at the new boarding house. She's serving dinner to anyone who wants to pay 50 cents, and I swear I have never had food like that in my entire life." Quinton grunted and returned to mending the fence line that had been damaged when one of his bulls decided to test its strength against the posts. "I mean it, boss. She makes these biscuits that just melt in your mouth, and her roast chicken has got some kind of herbs that make it taste like heaven itself. Then you best get back to work so you can afford to eat there again," Quinton said, hammering a post into the hard ground with more force than necessary. But Tommy would not let it rest. Every time he went to town, he came back talking about Mrs. Barrett's cooking. The other ranch hands started going too, coming back with satisfied grins and full bellies. Quinton found himself eating alone more often, his own attempts at cooking growing worse as his patience for it diminished. He lived on coffee, hard tack, and whatever simple meals he could throw together without thought. November arrived with frost on the ground and the work of preparing the ranch for winter. Quinton drove a small herd into town for sale, planning to use the money to stock up on supplies before the first serious snow. The cattle sale went well, and he found himself with extra money in his pocket and the entire afternoon ahead of him. His stomach growled, reminding him that he had eaten nothing since a piece of dried beef at dawn. The boarding house stood on Elm Street, a 2-story structure that had been freshly painted white with blue shutters. Smoke rose from the chimney, and through the windows, Quinton could see tables set with actual tablecloths. He almost walked past it, but his stomach insisted otherwise, and he found himself pushing open the front door. The smell hit him first. Roasting meat, fresh bread, something sweet and warm with cinnamon. The front room had been converted into a dining area with 6 tables, half of them occupied by townspeople and travelers. A woman emerged from what must have been the kitchen, carrying 2 plates of food, and Quinton felt something shift in his chest that he had not felt in 2 decades. She was not young, perhaps in her middle 30s, with dark blonde hair pinned up in a practical bun and flour dust on her sleeve. But it was her face that caught him. She had laugh lines around her eyes and a determined set to her jaw that spoke of someone who had faced hardship and refused to be broken by it. When she saw him standing in the doorway, she smiled with genuine warmth. "Welcome. Please, sit anywhere you like. Dinner today is pot roast with carrots and potatoes, and I have apple pie for dessert." Quinton nodded and took a seat at a table near the window, removing his hat and setting it on the empty chair beside him. He watched as she moved between tables, refilling coffee cups and chatting easily with her customers. There was a grace to her movements despite the obvious hard work she was doing, and when she laughed at something one of the railroad men said, the sound filled the room like music. She approached his table with a coffee pot and a cup. "You are Mr. Irons, are you not? Some of your ranch hands eat here regularly. They speak highly of you. Do they?" It was not a question. "They do. Coffee," he nodded, and she poured, the steam rising between them. Up close, he could see that her eyes were green with flecks of gold, and her hands, though feminine, bore the marks of work just as his did. "I am Grace Barrett. I will bring your dinner right out." She disappeared into the kitchen, and Quinton found himself sitting straighter, aware suddenly of the dust on his clothes and the roughness of his appearance. He was a big man, broad in the shoulders and thick in the chest from years of physical labor. His face was weathered, with lines carved deep from sun and wind, and his dark hair had gone mostly gray at the temples. He had not cared about his appearance in years, but now he wished he had at least washed his face before coming inside. Grace returned with a plate piled high with pot roast, vegetables glistening with butter, and a biscuit that was golden brown and steaming. She set it before him with a smile. "I hope you enjoy it." Quinton looked down at the food, picked up his fork and cut into the meat. It was tender, falling apart at the touch, and when he put it in his mouth, flavor exploded across his tongue. Herbs, rich gravy, meat that had been cooked with care and attention. He chewed slowly, then reached for the biscuit. It was still warm, the crust crispy while the inside remained soft and fluffy. He broke it open, watched the steam escape, and took a bite. Butter and buttermilk, a hint of honey, and something else he could not identify. The texture was perfect, and the taste was unlike anything he had experienced since Martha had been alive. Grace was at another table when Quinton heard himself speak, his voice rough from disuse in social settings. "These are good." The room did not fall silent, but Grace stopped mid-pour and turned to look at him. 3 words, simple words, but from the expression on her face she understood they meant something. She crossed back to his table, her eyes searching his face. "Thank you, Mr. Irons. That means a great deal." He nodded and returned to his meal, but he could feel her watching him, and something in his chest that had been frozen for 20 years began, just barely, to thaw. He finished every bite on his plate, and when Grace offered pie, he accepted. The apple pie was perfect, the crust flaky, the filling sweet and tart with just the right amount of cinnamon. He ate it slowly, making it last, and when he was done, he left $1 on the table for a meal that cost 50 cents. That night, back at the ranch, Quinton lay in his bed and stared at the ceiling. He could still taste those biscuits, still see Grace's smile when he had praised her cooking. 3 words. In 20 years, he had not found it in himself to compliment anyone's efforts, not even his most loyal ranch hands. But those biscuits had pulled the words from some deep place he thought had died with Martha. The next week, he found an excuse to go to town. Supplies he did not really need, business that could have waited. He tied his horse outside the boarding house at noon and went inside. Grace was there, of course, serving lunch to a table of travelers. When she saw him, her smile brightened. "Mr. Irons, welcome back. Today I have fried chicken and greens with cornbread." He took the same seat as before and waited. The chicken was crispy on the outside and juicy inside, seasoned with something that made his mouth water. The cornbread was sweet and dense, perfect for soaking up the pot liquor from the greens. He ate steadily, aware that Grace glanced his way more than once. When she came to refill his coffee, she lingered. "Your men tell me you run one of the best ranches in the county. It is adequate. They say you are fair but demanding, that you work harder than any of them. A man should not ask others to do what he will not do himself." She nodded, approval in her eyes. "My father used to say the same thing. He was a baker in St. Louis. I learned to cook at his side." "Your husband?" Quinton surprised himself by asking. Grace's smile faltered just slightly. "He passed 3 years ago. Cholera outbreak. We had no children and his family had no love for me, so I sold what we had and came here to start fresh. Nevada seemed like a town that could use a good boarding house." "It can." He paused, the words difficult. "You cook well. Very well." "Thank you, Mr. Irons." She refilled his cup, her hand steady. "May I ask you something? Why did you stop complimenting food?" The question was bold, almost too bold, but her tone was gentle, not prying. Quinton stared into his coffee, watching the steam rise. "My wife. 20 years ago. There has been no point since." Grace was quiet for a moment, then she reached out and touched his hand briefly, so briefly he might have imagined it. "I am sorry for your loss, but I think she would be sad to know you have been denying yourself even the small pleasures of a good meal." She moved away to tend to other customers, and Quinton sat with those words settling into his bones. Would Martha be sad? She had been a woman who found joy in everything, who believed that life should be lived fully even when it was hard. Maybe Grace was right. He started coming to town twice a week, then 3 times. Always at different times, always with some excuse, but always ending up at Grace's table. They began to talk, small conversations at first, about the weather and the town and the railway expansion. Then deeper things. Grace told him about her childhood in St. Louis, about learning to bake at dawn before school, about meeting her husband at a church social and thinking he was the most handsome man she had ever seen. "But handsome does not mean much when the fever takes someone," she said one afternoon, her voice steady but sad. "He was a good man, but we were not a passionate match. We were companions more than lovers. I cared for him, and I mourned him, but I would be lying if I said my heart was shattered beyond repair." Quinton found himself sharing things he had not spoken aloud in years. About Martha, about the early days of the ranch when they had nothing but dreams and determination. About the way she had died, the fever taking her so fast he barely had time to say goodbye. About the silence that had settled over his life afterward. "I think I was angry," he admitted one day in December, snow falling outside the windows while they sat alone in the dining room after the lunch rush had cleared. "Angry at God for taking her. Angry at myself for not being able to save her, and I punished myself by refusing to find joy in anything." Grace reached across the table and took his hand, her fingers warm and strong. 20 years is a long time to carry anger, Quinton. It was the first time she had used his given name, and hearing it from her lips made his heart stutter. He turned his hand over and held hers, marveling at how right it felt. "I think those biscuits broke something loose in me," he said, allowing himself a small smile. "Or maybe it was the woman who made them." Grace's cheeks flushed pink, and she smiled back. "I have been hoping you would say something like that." Your men may not realize it, but they have been playing matchmaker, telling me stories about you every time they come to eat. How you stayed up 3 nights straight when that storm hit last spring, making sure all the cattle were accounted for. How you paid for Tommy's mother's doctor bills when she took sick. How you are hard but never cruel, demanding but never unfair. They talk too much. They admire you, and I have come to admire you too. She squeezed his hand. When you said those 3 words about my biscuits, I knew you were someone special. It takes courage to let yourself feel again after loss. Quinton stood, still holding her hand, and drew her to her feet. They stood close, closer than propriety might dictate, and he could smell the flour and cinnamon that seemed to cling to her always. Grace Barrett, I am not a young man anymore, and I am set in my ways. But I find that when I am with you, those ways do not seem as fixed as I thought. Would you allow me to court you properly? Her smile was radiant. I would like that very much. The winter of 1882 turned into the most unexpected season of Quinton Irons's life. He courted Grace with the same determination he applied to everything, riding into town regardless of whether to take her to church socials, to walk with her through the snowy streets, to sit in her kitchen while she baked and tell her about his day. The boarding house thrived, partly because Grace was an excellent cook and partly because people loved seeing the grizzled cattleman softening in her presence. Tommy and the other ranch hands were delighted, teasing Quinton mercilessly, but always with affection. The ranch ran as efficiently as ever, but now there was something to look forward to beyond the work. Grace began visiting the ranch on Sundays, her day of rest, and the men quickly learned that those were the days they ate like kings. She would take over the kitchen and produce meals that had them groaning with satisfaction, and Quinton would watch her work with something very close to contentment in his eyes. "You have changed, boss," Tommy said one evening after Grace had returned to town. "You smile now." "I did not know you could smile. I always could, I just had no reason to. She is good for you. Are you going to marry her?" Quinton considered the question seriously. "If she will have me, I need to do it right, though. She deserves that." He spent the next 2 weeks planning. He had money saved, more than most people realized, because he had spent 20 years doing nothing but working and saving. He rode to Kansas City on the train and found a jeweler, selecting a ring with a small diamond that caught the light and threw rainbows. He arranged for a special dinner at the boarding house, paying Grace to close to regular customers for one evening, and he enlisted Tommy's help in getting everything ready. The night he chose was in mid-February, unseasonably warm with the promise of early spring. Grace had agreed to the private dinner, curious but not suspicious, and when Quinton arrived at the boarding house, he found the dining room transformed. Tommy had helped set up candles, and the table was set with Grace's best dishes. She emerged from the kitchen wearing a dress he had not seen before, deep blue with ivory lace at the collar, and his breath caught. "You are beautiful." She blushed, pleased. "You clean up rather well yourself, Mr. Irons." He did. He had gotten a haircut, trimmed his beard, and wore his Sunday suit, the one he had bought for Martha's funeral and rarely touched since. They sat down to dinner, and Grace served the meal she had prepared. Roast beef with roasted vegetables, fresh bread, and a chocolate cake for dessert. They talked and laughed, the conversation flowing easily now after months of growing closer. When the meal was done, and Quinton had praised every dish with words that came more easily each time, he stood and walked around the table to kneel beside her chair. Grace's eyes went wide, her hand flying to her mouth. "Grace Barrett, you brought light back into my life when I thought I would live the rest of my days in shadow. You are kind and strong and talented, and you make me want to be better than I have been. I am not a young man, and I carry scars both seen and unseen, but if you will have me, I promise to spend every day trying to make you happy. Will you marry me?" He pulled the ring from his pocket and Grace's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, Quinton, yes, yes, of course I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and she pulled him up to kiss him. A kiss that started gentle and grew passionate, 20 years of loneliness melting away in the warmth they created together. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless and laughing. "I love you," Grace said, her hands on his face. "I did not think I would find love again, real love, the kind that makes your heart race and your soul sing. But here you are." "Here we are," Quinton corrected, pulling her close again. "Together." They were married in April, when the prairie was green and wildflowers dotted the hills. The church in Nevada was packed with townspeople, ranch hands, and friends Grace had made through her boarding house. Tommy stood up as Quinton's best man, grinning like a fool, and Grace's friend Clara from the general store served as her matron of honor. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, and when the preacher pronounced them man and wife, the kiss they shared brought cheers from the congregation. Grace moved into the ranch house, and together they transformed it from a place of mere survival into a home. She brought curtains and rugs, plants for the windows and paintings for the walls. The kitchen became her domain, and the men who worked for Quinton quickly learned that meal times were now events to anticipate rather than endure. Grace cooked with joy, and that joy infused everything she made. But more than the physical changes, Grace brought laughter back to the ranch. She told stories and sang while she worked, and she had a way of drawing out the best in people. The ranch hands adored her, and Quinton found himself relaxing in ways he had not known he needed. He laughed more, talked more, and though he remained the demanding boss his men expected, there was a warmth to him now that had been absent for 2 decades. On warm evenings, Quinton and Grace would sit on the porch and watch the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. He would hold her hand and marvel at the fact that he had been given a second chance at happiness, something he had never expected or thought he deserved. "What are you thinking?" Grace asked one such evening, her head resting on his shoulder. "That I am grateful. For you. For this. For those biscuits that got 3 words out of me." She laughed, the sound he loved most in the world. "Best biscuits I ever made if they brought me you. Make them again tomorrow. Every day if you want them, though you have become rather free with your compliments now. I get at least a dozen words of praise per meal. You deserve every one of them." He kissed the top of her head. "I love you, Grace Irons. And I love you, Quinton Irons, my grumpy cattleman who was not so grumpy after all." The seasons turned, and their life together settled into a rhythm that felt both comfortable and exciting. Grace kept the boarding house open 3 days a week, enjoying the work and the connection to town, while spending the rest of her time at the ranch. Quinton discovered that he enjoyed helping her in the kitchen sometimes, peeling vegetables or kneading bread while she directed him with patient amusement. "You are terrible at this," she said one afternoon, watching him attempt to roll out pie dough. "I am a cattleman, not a baker, clearly." She moved behind him, her arms coming around to guide his hands. "Like this, gentle but firm, you are trying to wrestle it into submission. That usually works with cattle. Pie dough is not a stubborn heifer, my love." They laughed together, and the pie that eventually emerged from the oven was lopsided but delicious, and Quinton felt a pride in it that surprised him. He was learning new things at 43, discovering parts of himself that had been dormant. In the fall of 1883, Grace told him she was pregnant. They were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, and she had been unusually quiet all evening. When she finally spoke the words, Quinton felt his world tilt and resettle in a new configuration. "A baby." His voice was rough with emotion. "Yes, The doctor in town confirmed it. I am about 3 months along, so the baby should arrive in early spring. She watched his face anxiously. I know we have not discussed children. I am not young for this, and I know the risks, but Quinton, I want this child. Our child. He crossed to her and pulled her into his arms, holding her as carefully as if she were made of glass. I want this child too, more than I knew I could want anything. Are you well? Do you need to rest? Should you stop working at the boarding house? She laughed against his chest. I am pregnant, not ill. Women have been having babies while working for thousands of years. I will be fine as long as you do not smother me with worry. But worry he did in his quiet, intense way. He insisted she let him handle all the heavy work. He rode into town more frequently to check on her, and he read every book about pregnancy and childbirth he could get his hands on. Grace tolerated his hovering with good humor, knowing it came from love and, perhaps, from the memory of losing Martha. One night in December, she found him sitting in what would be the nursery, a small room they had begun preparing. He was holding a tiny nightgown she had sewn, and his eyes were wet with tears. Quinton, he looked up at her, his weathered face vulnerable in the lamplight. I am afraid. Martha died of fever and childbirth is dangerous. If I lost you, Grace, I do not think I could survive it. She knelt beside his chair, taking his hands in hers. You cannot think that way. Yes, there are risks, but there are risks in everything. I am strong and I have a good doctor and I have you. We will face this together just like we face everything else. I love you so much it terrifies me. I know. I love you the same way, but fear cannot rule us, Quinton. We have to trust that the same force that brought us together will see us through this. He pulled her close, and they sat together in the growing darkness, holding each other and the hope of the future growing between them. Winter passed slowly, each day bringing them closer to the arrival of their child. Grace bloomed in her pregnancy, her face glowing with health and happiness despite the normal discomforts. She continued cooking, though she accepted help more readily now, and the boarding house remained popular with travelers and townspeople alike. In March, when the first hints of spring touched the prairie, Grace's labor began. It was evening and they were finishing dinner when she gasped and gripped the table. Quinton was on his feet instantly, his face pale. It is time, Grace said, breathing through the contraction. Send Tommy for the doctor, and Quinton breathed. You are white as a sheet. He forced himself to calm, to think clearly. Tommy was dispatched at a gallop to fetch Dr. Morrison from town, and Clara arrived shortly after to help. Quinton stayed by Grace's side, holding her hand and wiping her brow, feeling helpless in a way that all his strength and capability could not address. The labor was long and hard. Grace bore it with courage, but Quinton could see her exhaustion growing as the hours stretched on. He talked to her, telling her stories about the ranch, about the first time he saw her, about how much he loved her and needed her and believed in her. And she held onto his words like a lifeline. Dawn was breaking when the baby finally arrived, a lusty cry filling the room. Doctor. Morrison held up a wriggling, red-faced infant and grinned. Congratulations, you have a son. Quinton looked down at Grace, who was exhausted but smiling, tears streaming down her face. A boy, she whispered. Our boy. The doctor placed the baby in Grace's arms, and Quinton sat beside them on the bed, staring in wonder at the tiny person they had created. The baby had a shock of dark hair, and his eyes, when they opened, were the same green gold as his mother's. He is perfect, Quinton said, his voice breaking. You are perfect. Thank you, Grace. Thank you for this gift. What should we name him? Grace asked, touching the baby's small hand. Quinton thought for a moment, remembering. Martha would have liked the name Henry after her father. Grace's eyes softened. Henry Irons, I love it. Henry it is. The baby wrapped his tiny fist around Quinton's finger, and in that moment, the last of the ice that had surrounded his heart for 20 years melted completely away. He was a husband and now a father, roles he had thought he would never fill again, and the joy he felt was almost too large to contain. Little Henry proved to be a healthy, happy baby with a loud voice and strong lungs. Grace recovered well from the birth, and the ranch house filled with the sounds of infant cries and delighted laughter. Quinton discovered that he was a devoted father, willing to walk the floor at midnight with a fussy baby, to change soiled diapers without complaint, and to make ridiculous faces just to earn a toothless smile. Tommy and the ranch hands were enchanted with the baby, taking turns visiting and bringing small gifts. The boarding house saw an influx of visitors wanting to congratulate Grace, and she accepted it all with her usual grace and warmth. As Henry grew from infant to toddler, Quinton watched with amazement as his son began to walk and then run, exploring the ranch with fearless curiosity. The boy had his mother's sunny disposition and his father's determination, a combination that promised both joy and exasperation in equal measure. On Henry's second birthday, Grace told Quinton she was pregnant again. This time, the news brought excitement rather than fear. The second pregnancy was easier than the first, and in the winter of 1886, they welcomed a daughter into the world. They named her Martha Grace, honoring both the past and the present, and Quinton held his tiny daughter and wept openly, something he would have been ashamed of years ago but now accepted as part of the full emotional life Grace had taught him to embrace. Martha Grace was a quieter baby than Henry had been, with her father's dark hair and serious eyes that seemed to take in everything. As she grew, it became clear she had inherited her mother's talent for cooking, often toddling into the kitchen to help in ways that were more hindrance than assistance, but always welcomed with patience. The years flowed like water over stones, smoothing rough edges and creating something beautiful. The ranch prospered under Quinton's steady management, and he became known throughout the region as a fair boss and skilled cattleman. But he was also known now as a man transformed by love, someone who had found his way back from grief to joy. Grace's boarding house became something of a legend, with people traveling extra miles just to taste her cooking. She trained several young women from town in her techniques, passing on her knowledge generously, but everyone agreed that her food had a special quality that could not quite be replicated. Perhaps it was the love she poured into every dish, or perhaps it was simply that she was Grace, and that was magic enough. Henry grew into a sturdy boy who loved the ranch and the cattle, following his father everywhere and asking endless questions. Martha Grace was more reserved, content to stay near her mother and learn the arts of cooking and homemaking, though she also proved to have a sharp mind for numbers that Quinton put to use teaching her the business side of ranching. On a summer evening in 1889, Quinton and Grace sat on their porch watching Henry and Martha Grace play in the yard. Henry was 7 now, Martha Grace 3, and they were chasing fireflies with jars, their laughter floating on the warm air. "Do you remember when you first walked into my boarding house?" Grace asked, her hand in Quinton's as always. "I remember everything about that day, the smell of your kitchen, the flower on your sleeve. The way you smiled at me like I was worth smiling at, even though I was just a grumpy old cattleman. You were never just anything. You were wounded and grieving, but you were never just ordinary." She squeezed his hand. "Those biscuits were the best thing I ever made, because they brought you back to life. You brought me back to life. The biscuits were just the key that opened a door I thought was locked forever." They watched their children play, the sky turning purple and gold with sunset, and Quinton felt a contentment so deep It was almost painful. He had lived through loss and grief, through anger and silence, through 20 years of merely existing. But Grace had shown him that life could be more, that the heart could heal and expand, that there was always room for more love if you were brave enough to accept it. "I praise your cooking every day now," he said with a slight smile. "You have made me quite the talker. You praise everything now. The sunrise, the cattle, our children. You have become downright poetic in your old age. I am only 49, hardly ancient. And I am 41, with 2 children and a boarding house and a husband who still makes my heart flutter when he walks into a room. We are doing rather well for a pair of widowed souls who thought their best days were behind them." Quinton pulled her close, kissing her temple. "Our best days are right now. Every day with you is the best day." The children ran up to the porch, their jars full of fireflies. "Look, Papa." "Look, Mama." Henry held up his jar proudly. "I caught 10, I caught 5, Martha Grace said, her small face serious. "But I let 2 go because they looked sad." Grace laughed. "That was kind of you, sweetheart. Shall we let them all go now and watch them fly away?" Together, the family opened the jars and released the fireflies, watching them rise into the darkening sky like tiny stars. Henry whooped with delight, and Martha Grace clapped her hands, and Grace leaned against Quinton with a sigh of pure happiness. Later, after the children were asleep, Quinton and Grace lay in their bed, the window open to let in the cool night air. Grace's head rested on his chest, and his arms were around her, and they talked in the quiet way of couples who know each other deeply. "What do you think Henry will be when he grows up?" Grace asked. "A cattleman, I expect. He has the heart for it, but I will support whatever he chooses. I do not want him to feel trapped by expectation. And Martha Grace, she will surprise us all, I think. She has your creativity and my stubbornness, a formidable combination. They are good children, we are blessed. We are, more than I ever thought possible." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I still miss Martha sometimes, not in the way I once did with that aching emptiness. But I remember her with fondness, and I think she would be happy knowing I found you, that I found this life. I am sure she would be. Just as I think my first husband would be happy knowing I found real, deep love with you. We honor them by living fully, by not letting their deaths define us forever. You are wise, Grace Irons. I am in love. It makes me wise." They fell asleep wrapped in each other, and the house settled into peaceful silence broken only by the occasional creak of floorboards and the whisper of wind through the eaves. The seasons continued their eternal cycle, and the Irons family grew and changed with them. Henry became a teenager, tall and broad-shouldered like his father, working the ranch with increasing skill and responsibility. Martha Grace developed into a poised young lady with her mother's warmth and her father's keen business sense. Grace still ran the boarding house, though less frequently now, and Quinton still ran his cattle, though he hired more men to handle the physical labor as he aged. In 1895, when Quinton was 55 and Grace was 47, they celebrated their 11th wedding anniversary with a party at the ranch. Friends came from all over the county, and the celebration lasted well into the night. Tommy, now the ranch foreman, gave a speech that had everyone laughing and crying in turns, talking about how Quinton had been the most fearsome boss until Grace had softened him with her biscuits and her love. "I remember the day he said those 3 words," Tommy told the crowd. "These are good. I thought the world had ended because the boss never said anything was good, but Mrs. Irons just smiled like she knew a secret, and sure enough, within a year they were married. Best thing that ever happened to this ranch, and to all of us who work here." Quinton stood and raised his glass. "To my wife, who saved me from myself. who taught me that life is meant to be lived, not just endured, who gave me children and joy and a reason to wake up every morning with gratitude. I love you, Grace, more today than yesterday and less than tomorrow." Grace's eyes shone with tears as she stood and kissed him, and the crowd cheered and applauded. It was a perfect night, full of love and laughter and the kind of deep satisfaction that comes from a life well lived. But life, even a good one, is not without challenges. In the winter of 1896, a severe blizzard struck Missouri, bringing temperatures lower than anyone could remember and snow that piled in drifts taller than a man. Quinton and his men worked around the clock to keep the cattle alive, breaking ice on water troughs and hauling hay through the deep snow. Grace kept the house warm and the food coming, feeding the exhausted men and tending to anyone who showed signs of frostbite. Henry, now 13, worked alongside his father with grim determination. Martha Grace, 9 years old, helped her mother without complaint, even when her hands were red and raw from the cold water used for cooking and cleaning. The blizzard lasted for 5 days, and when it finally broke, they had lost some cattle but fewer than many neighboring ranches. The work and planning Quinton had put into winterizing his operation paid off, and though he was exhausted, he was also proud of his family and his men. "We made it through," Grace said, serving hot soup to the gathered men in the kitchen. "Together, as always." Quinton looked around at the tired, proud faces and nodded. "You all did well. Take tomorrow to rest and we will assess the damage after that." That night, he held Grace extra close, aware of how fragile life could be, how quickly things could change. But she was there, warm and solid in his arms, and his children were safe in their beds, and his ranch had survived. It was enough. More than enough. Henry grew into a fine young man, taking on more responsibility at the ranch and showing every sign of becoming as skilled a cattleman as his father. At 18, he fell in love with the daughter of a neighboring rancher, a spirited girl named Alice who could ride as well as any man and was not afraid of hard work. Quinton and Grace approved of the match, seeing in the young couple the same kind of partnership they had built together. Henry and Alice married in the spring of 1900, and Quinton found himself adjusting to the idea of being a grandfather before too long. The young couple built a house on the ranch property, and Henry began managing more of the day-to-day operations while Quinton gradually stepped back into an advisory role. Martha Grace showed no interest in marriage yet, instead focusing on expanding her mother's boarding house business. At 14, she was already developing new recipes and thinking about ways to serve more customers. Grace encouraged her daughter's ambitions, proud of her independence and creativity. Quinton was 60 years old now, his hair completely gray and his face even more weathered by sun and wind and time. But his eyes were bright with life, and his laugh came easily, and he moved with the confidence of a man who knew exactly who he was and what mattered to him. On a warm June evening in 1901, he and Grace took their customary seats on the porch. The ranch spread out before them, cattle grazing peacefully, the hills rolling away toward the horizon. From Henry's house came the sound of voices and laughter. Martha Grace was in town at the boarding house overseeing the dinner service. "We have built something good here," Quinton said, taking Grace's hand. "A legacy, not just the ranch but a family, a life. We have indeed, and it all started with Biscuits." She smiled at the memory. Who would have thought that butter and flour could change everything? It was not the biscuits, it was you. The biscuits just gave me permission to acknowledge what I felt. What did you feel that first day? He thought about it, remembering. Hope. For the first time in 20 years, I felt hope. And then you smiled at me, and I felt something even more dangerous. What was that? possibility. The possibility that I could be more than the hollow man I had become, that there might be joy waiting for me if I was brave enough to reach for it. Grace leaned her head on his shoulder. You were brave. You are brave. And I am so grateful you walked into my boarding house that day. I am grateful you made those biscuits. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red and purple. The prairie stretched out endlessly, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled its lonely song. But Quinton felt no loneliness, only the deep contentment of a man who had been given a second chance and had seized it with both hands. In 1902, Henry and Alice welcomed their first child, a boy they named Quinton after his grandfather. The baby was healthy and loud, and Quinton Sr. held his namesake with a mixture of pride and wonder. He was a grandfather now, and the cycle of life continued, each generation building on what came before. Martha Grace, at 16, was running the boarding house almost entirely on her own now, with Grace supervising and helping but no longer doing the bulk of the work. The girl had inherited her mother's talent and added her own innovations, and the boarding house was more successful than ever. Quinton reduced his work even further, content to spend his days overseeing rather than laboring. He and Grace had more time together now, taking long walks across the ranch, visiting with friends in town, simply enjoying each other's company. The years had only deepened their love, adding layers of shared experience and mutual understanding. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1903, Quinton arranged a surprise for Grace. He had Tommy and the men set up a special dinner on the hilltop overlooking the ranch, with a table and chairs and lanterns for when darkness fell. He rode there with Grace in the late afternoon, and when she saw what he had done, she cried with joy. "You old romantic," she said, kissing him. "After all these years, you still surprise me. You deserve surprises. You deserve everything." He pulled out her chair and served her himself, a meal he had actually cooked with Martha Grace's help. It was not as good as Grace's cooking, not even close, but she praised every bite extravagantly. "This is wonderful," she declared, even though the chicken was slightly dry and the vegetables a bit overdone. "You are a terrible liar." "I am not lying. It is wonderful because you made it for me. The taste is secondary to the love." They ate as the sun set, and then they sat together watching the stars emerge, the lanterns casting a warm glow around them. Quinton thought about the man he had been 20 years ago, silent and bitter, and closed off from the world. That man seemed like a stranger now. "I have lived 2 lives," he said thoughtfully. "The first 43 years and the last 20, the second life has been better. Both lives made you who you are, the grief and the healing, the loss and the finding. You cannot have one without the other. Perhaps. But I am grateful that you were the one I found, that you saw past the gruff exterior to the man underneath. I saw a man in pain who was trying very hard not to show it, and I saw that with just a little warmth, a little care, that pain might ease. I wanted to be the one to help you." "You did more than help. You remade me." "No." Grace cupped his face in her hands. "You remade yourself. I just provided the right conditions for growth, like good soil for a seed, but the seed was always there, waiting." They stayed on the hilltop until late into the night, talking and laughing and remembering. When they finally rode back to the ranch house, the moon was high and the world was silver and quiet. They went to bed wrapped in each other's arms as they had every night for 20 years, and slept the peaceful sleep of people who knew they were exactly where they belonged. The years continued to pass, marked by the usual milestones of life. Henry and Alice had 2 more children, both daughters. Martha Grace eventually fell in love with a young lawyer from Kansas City, who visited Nevada on business, and was so charmed by her cooking that he extended his stay for 3 weeks. They married when Martha Grace was 19, and she moved to the city but returned frequently to help with the boarding house and visit her family. Quinton aged gracefully, his body slowing but his mind remaining sharp. He still rode out to check the cattle most days, though now more for the pleasure of it than necessity. Henry ran the ranch with skill and dedication, and Quinton was content to be the elder statesman, offering advice when asked but not interfering. Grace aged too, her hair going silver and her face showing the lines of a life well lived. But she remained beautiful to Quinton, perhaps more so now than ever, because he could see the history written in those lines, the story of their life together. In the spring of 1910, Quinton fell ill with pneumonia. It came on suddenly, and despite Dr. Morrison's best efforts and Grace's devoted care, he weakened rapidly. On a clear April morning, surrounded by his family, Quinton Irons prepared to say goodbye to the life he had loved so much. Grace sat beside him on the bed, holding his hand, her face wet with tears but her voice steady. "You have to fight, Quinton. I am not ready to let you go." He smiled at her, his breathing labored but his eyes clear. "Grace, my love, I have had 27 years more than I thought I would. 27 years of joy and love and meaning because of you. It was not enough time. It never would have been enough. I could have 1,000 years with you and still want more." He squeezed her hand weakly. "But I am not afraid. I am grateful for every moment. For those biscuits that got 3 words out of me, for your patience and your love, for our children and grandchildren, for the life we built." Henry stood at the foot of the bed, his own tears flowing freely. Martha Grace was on her father's other side, holding his free hand. The grandchildren were being cared for elsewhere, too young to understand what was happening. "Tell me you love me one more time," Grace whispered. "I love you. I have loved you since the moment I tasted your cooking and realized I could still feel. I will love you beyond death, beyond time, beyond anything that comes after." His voice was fading. "Do not mourn too long, Grace. Live, like you taught me to live, find joy. You are not meant for shadows. I cannot imagine life without you. You do not have to imagine it, just live it. For both of us now." He closed his eyes, his breathing slowing, and with Grace's hand in his and his children beside him, Quinton Irons slipped away peacefully. The man who had been silent for 20 years after losing his first love had died surrounded by the sound of weeping, by declarations of love, by the evidence of a life that mattered. Grace mourned deeply, as was natural and right. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people from across the county, all coming to pay respects to a man who had been respected and loved. Tommy, now in his 50s himself, gave the eulogy, his voice breaking as he talked about the boss who had given him his first job and taught him what it meant to be a man of integrity. "He was hard," Tommy said, "but never cruel, demanding but always fair. And when he loved with his whole heart. Mrs. Irons, you made him happy. That is the greatest legacy any of us could ask for." In the months after Quinton's death, Grace struggled. The world seemed dimmer without him, food tasted less vibrant, and the ranch house felt too large and too empty. But she remembered his final words, his command to live, and she tried. Henry was a steady presence, running the ranch as his father would have wanted, making sure his mother was cared for. Martha Grace visited frequently, bringing her children to fill the house with noise and life. And slowly, Grace began to heal. She threw herself back into the boarding house with renewed energy, finding solace in the work she loved. She taught cooking classes for young women in town, passing on her knowledge and her passion. She spent time with her grandchildren, telling them stories about their grandfather and making sure they knew the man he had been. A year after Quinton's death, on what would have been their 28th anniversary, Grace made biscuits. The same biscuits that had broken through his silence all those years ago. She sat at her kitchen table and ate one slowly, remembering his face when he had tasted them that first time, the way his eyes had widened slightly, the three simple words that had changed everything. "These are good," she said aloud to the empty kitchen. "They always were, Quinton, and you were good too, the best thing that ever happened to me." She cried then, letting the grief flow through her without resistance. But when the tears stopped, she felt something else too, gratitude. For the years they had shared, for the love they had built, for the family they had created together. Quinton had been right. 27 years was not enough, but it was also everything. Grace lived for another 12 years, active and engaged until the end. She saw her grandchildren grow and her great-grandchildren born. She kept the boarding house open until she was in her 70s, finally closing it only when her body could no longer keep up with the demands. She was beloved in Nevada, known for her kindness and her cooking, and the story of how she had brought a grieving cowboy back to life with her biscuits. When she died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 73 in 1922, she was buried beside Quinton on the hill overlooking the ranch. The headstone read, "Grace Irons, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother. She fed bodies and souls." Beside it, Quinton's stone read, "Quinton Irons, cattleman and husband. He learned to live again." The ranch remained in the family, passed down through Henry and eventually to his children. The boarding house building still stood in Nevada, though it had become other things over the years. But people remembered. They remembered the grizzled cowboy who had not praised a meal in 20 years, and they remembered the woman whose biscuits got 3 words out of him. Most of all, they remembered that love could come at any age, that grief did not have to be permanent, and that sometimes the most powerful transformations began with the simplest things. A plate of food, a kind word, a willingness to try again. And somewhere, beyond time and space, Quinton and Grace were together again, laughing over biscuits and planning forever, the way they always had, the way they always would, because some love is strong enough to transcend even death itself, building a legacy that echoes through generations, a testament to the power of opening your heart when you thought it was closed forever. The story of their love became family legend, told and retold around dinner tables and campfires, reminding each new generation that it is never too late to change, never too late to heal, never too late to find the courage to feel again. 3 words had opened a door, but it was a lifetime of love that had walked through it, creating something beautiful and lasting and true. And on quiet evenings when the wind blew across the Missouri prairie, people said you could still feel their presence on the ranch. 2 souls intertwined, forever grateful for biscuits and second chances and the brave decision to try again, to love again, to live again with full hearts and open arms, embracing all the joy and pain and beauty that life offered, knowing that together they could face anything, that together they were home.